The man stood motionless among the twisted metal and splintered wood. Smoke still rose from the blackened chassis of what had been a stagecoach just hours before. The setting sun painted the desert in deep oranges and reds, casting long shadows across the wreckage. His thin frame seemed to waver in the heat still radiating from the debris. A leather satchel hung from his trembling fingers, its surface scorched but intact. He tilted his head as if listening to something only he could hear. Laughter, screams, prayers. The echoes of voices now silenced forever. The old man's lips moved, forming words that had no place in this land. They flowed like water over stones, rhythmic and ancient. Tears carved clean lines down his dust-covered face as he spoke to the empty air, his voice carrying secrets no one around him could understand. Sheriff Mills approached cautiously, boots crunching on the scattered debris. "Sir, you're the only one we found alive. Can you tell me what happened here?" The old man turned slowly. His eyes, pale blue against his weathered skin, focused on the sheriff. He spoke again in that same strange tongue, the words tumbling out with urgency. The sheriff shook his head. "I don't understand you, mister." The old man clutched the satchel tighter and looked back at the wreckage. Whatever he knew about the explosion, whatever he had seen, remained locked behind words no one could decipher. White Rock wasn't much of a town, just a collection of sun-bleached buildings stretched along a single dusty street. The general store, the saloon, the blacksmith, and a dozen other weathered structures housed the 100-odd souls who called this harsh corner of the frontier home. Most buildings leaned slightly, as if tired from years of standing against the relentless wind. Elias Thornfield lived in a small cabin at the edge of town. Once, he had commanded respect in bustling port cities, his talent for languages making him indispensable to merchants and diplomats alike. He had moved effortlessly between worlds, translating not just words but intentions, hopes, and fears. Now he was just the odd old man who sometimes muttered in strange tongues. Elias stepped onto his porch, squinting against the morning light. His fingers, once nimble with pen and paper, now ached with the coming weather. He watched as Mrs. Holloway herded her children toward the schoolhouse, nodding politely when she glanced his way. She didn't wave back. "There goes the foreigner," came a whisper from two men loading supplies outside the general store. They didn't bother lowering their voices. "Heard him talking to himself again last night. Speaking devil words, I reckon." Elias pretended not to hear. He had grown accustomed to the sideways glances, the hushed conversations that stopped when he approached. 20 years in White Rock, and still he remained an outsider. He made his way down the street toward the post office. Every Tuesday, he checked for letters that never came. The postmaster, Jenkins, barely looked up from his ledger as Elias entered. "Nothing today, Mr. Thornfield," Jenkins said before Elias could ask. Elias nodded and turned to leave. The routine was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. He would return to his cabin, prepare a simple meal, and lose himself in the few books he had managed to bring with him when he left his old life behind. As he walked back through town, his mind drifted to memories of crowded docks, of ships arriving from distant shores, of the respect in men's eyes when he solved problems with his words. He remembered the weight of responsibility, the pride of purpose, and he remembered why he had left it all behind. The knock came as darkness fell. 3 sharp raps that startled Elias from his reading. Visitors were rare enough to be concerning. He opened the door to find young Timothy Wells, the blacksmith's son, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Mr. Thornfield," the boy said, thrusting a sealed envelope toward him. "A man rode through town and paid me 2 bits to deliver this to you. Said it was important." Elias took the envelope. "Thank you, Timothy." The boy lingered, clearly hoping for a coin of his own. Elias reached into his pocket and produced a penny, which the boy snatched before darting away into the gathering darkness. Elias closed the door and examined the envelope. No name, no address, just a wax seal he hadn't seen in decades. His hands trembled as he broke it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in flowing script. Not English, not Spanish. Something older, something he hadn't read or spoken aloud in many years. His eyes moved over the characters, translating automatically as he had been trained to do. The debt remains unpaid. The promise unfulfilled. Come to Widow's Canyon. What was lost may yet be found. Elias sank into his chair, the letter clutched in his shaking hand. Widow's Canyon lay 3 days' journey to the west, a place of dark history and darker legends. A place he had sworn never to return to. The letter wasn't signed, but he knew who had sent it. Only one other person alive knew both this language and what had happened at the canyon all those years ago. He stared into the dying embers of his fire. The past he had buried was clawing its way back to the surface. The letter offered no choice, only a summons he could not ignore. Sleep eluded him that night. By dawn, he had packed his few belongings into his old leather satchel. Whatever awaited him at Widow's Canyon, he would face it with what dignity he had left. Elias set out as the first light broke over the eastern horizon. The journey would be difficult for a man his age, but necessity drove him forward. He followed the old trading road, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. By midday, he heard the rumble of wheels behind him. A stagecoach approached, its team of 4 horses moving at a steady pace. Elias stepped to the side of the road, expecting it to pass by. Instead, it slowed to a stop beside him. "Where you headed, old-timer?" the driver called down. "Widow's Canyon," Elias replied, surprised at how the words caught in his throat. The driver whistled. "That's where we're bound. Got room if you're willing to pay." Elias hesitated. He preferred to travel alone, to keep his thoughts and his past to himself. But his aging body reminded him of the long journey ahead. "How much?" he asked. $3 gets you to the canyon." Elias counted out the coins and climbed aboard. Inside sat 4 other passengers, a young couple dressed in their Sunday best, a woman in widow's black, and a grizzled man with the hard eyes of a prospector. "Name's Samuel Wright," the prospector said as Elias settled onto the bench. "This here's Mrs. Peterson," he nodded to the widow. "And the lovebirds are the Millers." The young couple smiled nervously. They couldn't have been more than 20, their clothes too fine for frontier travel. "Elias Thornfield," he offered, nodding to each in turn. "What brings you to Widow's Canyon, Mr. Thornfield?" Mrs. Peterson asked, her voice soft but curious. "An old promise," he said simply. The stagecoach lurched forward, beginning its journey west. Conversation flowed around Elias as the miles passed beneath them. Samuel spoke of a silver strike near the canyon, his eyes gleaming with the fever of potential wealth. The Millers mentioned a homestead they had purchased sight unseen, their voices filled with hope and uncertainty. Mrs. Peterson remained mostly silent, occasionally touching a locket around her neck. As the day wore on, Elias found himself drawn into their stories despite his reluctance. There was something familiar about them, something that resonated with memories he had long suppressed. "You don't talk much, Mr. Thornfield," Samuel observed as they stopped to water the horses. "But when you do, there's something different about your words. Where are you from originally?" "Many places," Elias replied. "I was a translator once. Languages came easily to me." "A translator?" young Mr. Miller exclaimed. "How fascinating. How many languages do you speak?" 14 fluently, Elias said. "Perhaps a dozen more with varying degrees of competence." The others looked at him with new interest, and for a moment, Elias felt a shadow of his former self, respected, valued. "Would you say something in another language?" Mrs. Miller asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. Elias hesitated, then spoke a brief greeting in Mandarin. The flowing tones felt strange on his tongue after so many years of disuse. "Beautiful," Mrs. Peterson whispered. "Like music." As they continued their journey, the landscape grew more rugged. Flat plains gave way to rolling hills, which in turn became the jagged approaches to Widow's Canyon. The conversation in the coach grew quieter, more subdued, as if the land itself demanded respect. On the 3rd day, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Elias felt a change in the air. A heaviness, a premonition. He glanced at his fellow passengers and saw the same unease reflected in their eyes. The stagecoach rounded a bend in the road, and suddenly the canyon opened before them, a great wound in the earth, its walls stained red like dried blood. The driver slowed the team, navigating the narrowing path with care. "Almost there," Samuel muttered, more to himself than to the others. Elias felt his heart pounding against his ribs. The letter in his pocket seemed to burn through the fabric, a reminder of why he had returned to this place of shadows and regret. The first explosion came without warning, a deafening roar that shook the stagecoach to its frame. The horses screamed in terror, bolting forward as a second blast erupted beneath them. Elias was thrown against the roof, then slammed back down as the coach tipped onto its side. Through the window, he saw flames engulfing the undercarriage, heard the terrified shrieks of his fellow passengers. A third explosion tore through the coach, and Elias felt himself flying through the air, tumbling across hard ground. Pain lanced through his body as he came to rest against a boulder. The world went silent for a moment, then returned in a rush of sound, crackling flames, groaning metal, and beneath it all, the soft whimpers of the dying. Elias pushed himself up, every movement sending waves of agony through his battered body. The stagecoach lay in ruins 20 yards away, engulfed in flames that reached toward the darkening sky. Of the driver and the horses, there was no sign. He staggered toward the wreckage, calling out for the others. Only silence answered him. As he neared the burning coach, he saw a hand extending from beneath a section of twisted metal, Mrs. Peterson's delicate fingers still clutching her locket. Beyond her lay Samuel, his prospector's dreams ended by a jagged piece of wood protruding from his chest. The Millers were still inside what remained of the coach, locked in a final embrace as the flames consumed them. Elias fell to his knees, overcome by the horror before him. How had he survived when all others had perished? Why had he been spared? As darkness fell completely, he became aware that his satchel still hung from his shoulder, somehow intact despite the violence of the explosion. With trembling hands, he opened it, seeking nothing in particular, perhaps just reassurance that something familiar remained in this nightmare. His fingers found an unfamiliar shape at the bottom, a hidden compartment he had never noticed before. He pulled it open, revealing a small, leather-bound journal. Elias stared at it in confusion. This was not his. He had never seen this journal before. He opened it to the first page and felt the blood drain from his face. The writing was in the same ancient script as the letter that had summoned him here, but this was not the same hand. This writing was achingly familiar. It belonged to Amara. Amara, who had taught him this language in the port of Alexandria. Amara, whose love had given his life meaning. Amara, whose death he had blamed himself for all these years. With shaking fingers, he turned the pages, reading words written decades ago. Amara's journal detailed her life after they had parted ways. Her journey to America, her settlement near Widow's Canyon, her wait for him to fulfill his promise to follow her. And then, entries from after the date he had received news of her death. Entries that could not exist. They told you I died. One passage read. They wanted the secret for themselves. I wait still, my love. I keep our knowledge safe, but I cannot guard it alone much longer. Elias closed the journal, his mind reeling. The letter, the journal, the explosion, they were all connected. Someone had lured him here, using memories of Amara as bait. But why kill the others? What possible threat could a young couple, a widow, and an aging prospector pose? Unless... He opened the journal again, scanning the later entries with growing horror. Amara had discovered something in the canyon, something valuable and dangerous, something people would kill for, and she had hidden it using a cipher only he could decode. The night grew colder as Elias huddled beside the remains of the stagecoach. The flames had died down, leaving only glowing embers to push back the darkness. He clutched the journal to his chest, lost in memories and revelations. Dawn found him still there, a solitary figure amid destruction. In the harsh light of morning, the full extent of the tragedy was laid bare. No one could have survived such violence, no one except him. He had been spared for a reason. As Elias gathered his strength to stand, he heard the approach of horses. Riders from White Rock, perhaps, investigating the smoke visible for miles around. He would have to explain what had happened here. But what could he say? That he had been lured by a ghost? That the others had died because of a secret he had spent decades trying to forget? Sheriff Mills was the first to reach him, dismounting with his hand on his pistol. What in God's name happened here? Elias opened his mouth to respond, but what emerged was not English. The words of Amara's people flowed from him unbidden, a lament for the dead, a confession of guilt, a plea for understanding. The sheriff stepped back, confusion and suspicion darkening his features. Speak English, old man. Who did this? Again, Elias tried, and again the ancient tongue poured forth. It was as if the journal had awakened something long dormant within him, something that could not be silenced. The other riders arrived, circling the wreckage with wary eyes. They saw the bodies, the destruction, and the old man speaking in tongues. In their minds, connections formed, false but understandable. "He's the only one alive," someone muttered. "Speaking devil words," another added. "Maybe he caused this somehow." Sheriff Mills raised a hand for silence. "We'll take him back to town. Sort this out proper." As they bound his hands and lifted him onto a horse, Elias realized the choice that lay before him. He could find a way to explain, to make them understand in a language they knew. Or he could remain silent, protecting the secret Amara had died for, the secret others had killed for today. The journal was still in his satchel. If anyone else decoded its contents. The ride back to White Rock passed in a blur of dust and whispered accusations. By the time they reached the town, word had spread of the Stagecoach disaster and the survivor, who spoke in tongues. They locked him in the jail, a small cell with iron bars and a single window too high to see through. Sheriff Mills tried once more to question him, but Elias remained silent now, watching the man with tired eyes. "Have it your way," the sheriff finally said. "But those people deserve justice. Sooner or later, you'll have to talk, in words we can understand." Alone in his cell, Elias removed the journal from his satchel. He had to decide. The knowledge Amara had protected could change the world or destroy it in the wrong hands. That's why she had encoded it in a language only he could read, trusting that someday he would come for her as promised. But he had failed her, and now others had died because of that failure. As night fell over White Rock, Elias thought of the passengers on the stagecoach. Their hopes, their dreams, their futures, all extinguished because they had the misfortune to travel with him. He saw Mrs. Peterson's fingers clutching her locket, the Millers in their final embrace, Samuel's eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. He thought of Amara waiting for him, year after year, keeping their secret safe while he built a new life far away, too afraid to face the past. "I'm sorry," he whispered in her language. "I should have come sooner." The moon rose, casting silver light through the high window. In its glow, Elias made his decision. He would not speak of what he knew, not in English, not in any tongue they would understand. The secret would die with him, as Amara had intended if he never returned. But he would not remain silent about those who had died today. They deserved to be remembered, their stories told, their lives honored. When Sheriff Mills returned in the morning, Elias was sitting calmly on his cot, the journal open in his lap. "Ready to talk sense now?" the sheriff asked. Elias looked up and began to speak, not in English, but in the ancient language of Amara's people. This time, however, he spoke slowly, with purpose. He was not trying to communicate facts, but to tell a story. The story of Samuel Wright and his dreams of silver, of the Millers and their hopes for a new life, of Mrs. Peterson and whatever secret lay within her locket. The sheriff sighed in frustration. This is getting us nowhere. But something in Elias's voice, in the rhythm and cadence of his words, made the man pause. There was meaning here, even if the words themselves were incomprehensible. Word spread through White Rock about the old translator's strange behavior. People came to the jailhouse to see for themselves, standing outside the barred window to listen as Elias spoke in his foreign tongue. They couldn't understand the words, but somehow, the emotion carried through. Women wiped tears from their eyes as he spoke of the young couple's love. Men nodded solemnly as he described Samuel's courage in the face of death. "He's telling their stories," Mrs. Holloway said one evening. "I can feel it." Days passed, and still Elias spoke, weaving tales of those who had died, honoring their memory in words no one could translate, but everyone seemed to feel. He spoke of their final moments, their bravery, their fear. He spoke of the explosion that had taken their lives and spared his own. What he did not speak of was the journal, or Amara, or the secret hidden in the cipher. Those words remained unspoken, locked away in his heart. Sheriff Mills eventually gave up trying to get a confession or even a coherent statement from Elias. With no evidence of wrongdoing beyond his strange behavior and miraculous survival, they could not hold him indefinitely. "You're free to go," Mills told him after a week. "But don't leave town. This isn't over." Elias nodded, gathering his satchel with the journal safely inside. He stepped out into the sunlight, blinking after days in the dimness of the jail. The townspeople watched him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. He was still the outsider, the stranger who spoke in tongues, but something had changed. They had heard him speak of the dead, even if they hadn't understood the words. Elias made his way back to his small cabin at the edge of town. Inside, he lit a fire in the hearth and opened the journal one last time. Amara's words, her discoveries, her love for him, all preserved in ink and paper. He read until the sun set, absorbing every detail, every clue to the location of her discovery. Then, with a heavy heart, he placed the journal in the flames. The paper curled and blackened, Amara's words turning to ash. The secret she had protected, that others had killed for, would remain hidden. It was too dangerous, too powerful to risk falling into the wrong hands. As the last page burned away, Elias felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had failed Amara in life, but in this final act, he honored her wish to protect their knowledge. The next morning, Elias rose before dawn. He packed his few belongings and left his cabin for the last time. White Rock was still sleeping as he made his way through town, past the general store, the saloon, the jail. At the edge of town, he paused and looked back. For 20 years, this place had been his refuge, his hiding place. Now it would become just another memory, another chapter in his long life. He turned west, toward Widow's Canyon. Not to uncover what Amara had hidden there. That secret would remain buried forever, but to pay his respects, to finally keep the promise he had made so long ago. As he walked, he began to speak aloud in Amara's language, telling her about the years they had spent apart, about his regrets, about his hopes for whatever time he had left. The words flowed easily now, no longer foreign to his tongue. Behind him, White Rock grew smaller in the distance. Some said later that they heard his voice on the wind that morning, speaking those strange, beautiful words that no one understood but everyone felt. They said he became a kind of ghost story in those parts. The old translator who survived when everyone else perished, who spoke a language no one knew, who disappeared one morning never to return. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right, people claimed they could hear him still, his voice carrying across the desert, telling stories of those who had lived and died, keeping their memory alive in words that transcended understanding. And in Widow's Canyon, where the stagecoach had exploded that fateful sunset, travelers reported seeing an old man sitting among the scattered remnants, speaking softly to someone only he could see. A conversation across time, across death itself. The secret Amara had discovered remained hidden, protected by love and sacrifice and words no one else could decipher. And Elias, the last keeper of that secret, faded into legend, a story told around campfires, a mystery never solved. In the end, it wasn't the words themselves that mattered, but the emotion behind them. Not the language, but the stories it preserved. Not the secret, but the love that had protected it. And somewhere, perhaps, Amara listened as Elias finally kept his promise, speaking to her in the ancient tongue they had shared, their voices mingling in the desert wind long after both had returned to dust.